So we're on to our last presentation to round out what's been an absolutely wonderful research symposium. I hope you've all gained a lot out of it. But our last talk is from Richard Heath at the Australian Farm Institute. And Richard's going to be talking about defining and quantifying trust in agricultural supply chains to inform development of digital platforms. So this project was one that's actually finished a few months ago now, but it was actually there to deliver to the agricultural industry the information that is needed to quantify and identify opportunities for the implementation of technology platforms that will resolve these trust issues within the agricultural supply chains. So Richard, over to you now. You've got the unenviable task of being very last of the symposium, but hopefully you can take us out with a bang.
Thanks, Mick. Yeah, I'll do my best. It's been a great couple of days, but it is long, so hopefully I can keep everyone interested in what we've been doing. I'll share my screen now. Why is that not working? God, you do this so many times. Here we go. Right.
There it is.
Yeah. Okay, so we, as you said, Mick, completed a few months ago a project that was entitled Defining and Quantifying the Components of Trust in Agricultural Value Chains to Inform the Development of Digital Platforms. And thanks, obviously, to Food Agility for funding the project, and the Integrity Systems Company as being the industry partner in the project. So, how did the project come about? Oh, that isn't. Sorry, my slides aren't changing for some reason. Oh, I've done this so many times, you think I would work out what's going on by now. Let me stop sharing that screen and share a different screen for 1 second. Okay, we'll try again. Okay.
There we go. That's working perfectly.
Right. How did the project come about? As part of our priority setting processes at AFI, a few years ago now, when blockchain was the rage, that we identified that the application of blockchain in agriculture was a research priority for us in terms of new policy and just a general understanding about blockchain and what it was going to do. We further identified the specific research gap as investigating the ability of digital technologies to address trust-related issues in agricultural value chains, being that one of the main identified advantages of blockchain as a technology was that the immutable aspect of it did solve a lot of trust issues in value chains. Now, this project had a reasonably long gestation period, and then the project itself took a little while to complete. So there was an evolution through the process of the project. Like all good projects, it was iterated over time as the understanding of blockchain certainly developed rapidly during the period that the project was in place. So the premise that a better understanding of the value proposition for solving trust issues in value chains was still valid. It is still valid. It will always be valid. We need to understand where the value is in fixing trust in value chains. But there was certainly a greater awareness of the potential limitations for blockchain as we went through the project. There was and is an ongoing need for a tool for businesses to assess the value proposition of technology, but it's less immediate, specifically related to blockchain than it was at the beginning of this process. I think, as I said, there's a greater awareness now just in terms of what blockchain is and what it can do. There's not quite as much hype around it. But the tool that was developed and that we worked on through this project still has a very useful application, and that it was more as could be better used as a discovery for problem definition in relation to value chains where particular issues are, and the identification of industry-wide approaches to technology application to be able to solve trust issues. The objectives of the project, and this was straight from the project contract, the primary objective being to define the components of trust in a selection of diverse agricultural supply chains, and that if it was successful or would deliver to industry the information needed to identify opportunities for implementation of technology platforms to address those trust issues. And one of the main outputs would be to develop a framework that went towards quantifying the trust, quantifying trust issues within value chains. So these were the original project objectives. So what is a value chain? Here's a very rough representation of a generic agricultural value chain. You've got the farm at one end, you've got inputs coming in, you've got feed, potentially a whole lot of things coming into the farm, and then out of the farm, you've got products that go through various stages towards processing, towards various market opportunities, whether they be domestic or overseas, and then eventually to a consumer. Now, every one of those boxes has a blue arrow in between them, and that relates to an transactional trust element. There is a transaction essentially that occurs each time something flows between each one of those boxes, and we've called those transactional trust elements. The entire value chain, though, and this is really important, involves systemic trust, and particularly in relation to where consumer trust sits. Consumers trust that the entire value chain is sound in terms of their perception of safety and participation in the value chain in terms of what they're going to buy. So what are the trust components that go to make up those transactional trust elements that build towards the overall systemic trust? So we identified 9 that we could distinguish or define as separate trust components that trust breakdowns essentially could be classified within. The first one being food fraud, the deliberate intention of tampering, substituting, adding to, diverting, or misrepresenting food ingredients, or food packaging. And then food safety, which is the process of handling, preparing, storing food in a manner which best reduces the risk of exposure to unsafe foods. Food recall, which is what you have to do once you have a food safety issue or some other issue, and that's involving actions taken to remove unsafe food from distribution, sale, and consumption. Transaction security, this happens right throughout value chains, particularly prevalent in some versus others, and that's the counterparty risk associated with the financial transactions that go on when things are transferred along value chains. Discovery, that is to do with the knowledge and visibility of relevant information, such as prices and stock volumes, that is available to stakeholders within value chains. Provenance, that's one that a lot of people understand, particularly consumers, which is claims around place of origin or other marketable attributes that can be attached to products in agricultural value chains. Certification, which is an external confirmation of products in agricultural value chains that they meet the requirements of a certifying body for a whole lot of different attributes. And then verification, which is different to certification in that it's just validating any claims essentially attached to food and beverage products to prove they are truthful and authentic, but not necessarily against a certification standard. It's just, if a product has something on the label saying that it has an attribute attached to it, just that can be verified in some way. So the report contains a whole heap of examples of breakdowns in trust in value chains from around the world over the last few years. This is just a small selection of them. The report lists more and goes into detail about them and classifies breakdowns of trust against those trust components, those 9 trust components that we identified. Now, it's important to understand, and this goes to the original premise in understanding how technology applications can be used to address trust breakdowns and what the value of those technology applications might be, is that trust within value chains is not homogeneous across different value chains and across different sectors. It varies enormously in terms of where trust is more likely to break down and what the importance of trust components are between different value chains. So in the red meat value chain, for instance, there's a significant issue with food fraud, particularly in overseas markets where you get bigger portions of carcasses that are exported and then broken down in markets overseas and substituted. At that point, there's particular fraud that goes on there with substitution. The cropping value chain, on the other hand, has a really significant issue with transaction security, with the sale of grain to traders and accumulators post-farm gate, and lots of recent examples where those traders have gone insolvent and the farmers have lost money as a result of that. So in trying to understand those trust components, to validate them, to see how important they were across different sectors and get a gauge on the value of solving those particular trust areas, we conducted a whole lot of guided interviews with representatives from 5 sectors within Australian agriculture, being red meat, wine, grains, seafood, and horticulture. And we also spoke to some general value chain participants as well, in the technology providers that were developing products to try and address some of these trust issues. Just with the scope of the project and the nature of the project, the intention of the interviews was not to gather exhaustive information, but really just to ground truth the approach we were taking related to whether our categorizing of trust components made sense, whether it was relatable to the participants in those industries. And so we asked them things around the relevance and significance of trust components in the sectors. Putting those 9 trust components out there, did they make sense? How relevant were they to their particular industry? And about whether they were aware of technologies that were available in their value chains that would address those trust components. And if there were technologies, what the barriers to uptake of those technologies were. And we also asked them to inform us about what the pain points are in their value chains in terms of where there's particular trust issues or more likely to be trust issues, and whether that correlated to points of opportunity where there could be a technology solution applied. So the trust components most relevant, and again, I'll just make it clear, this was a relatively limited sample just because of the scope of the project. But we felt, in terms of the people that we're speaking to within each sector, it was reasonably representative of the sector more broadly. So the trust components most relevant to red meat were food fraud, to wine, it was discovery. And that was particularly in relation to the relationship between grape growers and winemakers and vineyards. And so the independent grape growers and the bigger wine companies. And so that that understanding of prices, of quality requirements and so on, the discovery aspect, there was big issues around those trust transactions there. In grains, it was transaction security, as I've talked about previously, seafood, food safety, and horticulture food safety. The greatest need for technology solutions in red meat, it was really an end-to-end solution in terms of traceability and food fraud, and just a general solution for solving trust from one end of the value chain to the other. In wine, it was more related particularly to that transaction security between growers and point of sale. In grains, it was general visibility and transparency around the transactional elements, the financial transactional elements. seafood verification to address fraud, and horticulture traceability in cold chain systems. So there were technology solutions that were out there. Some of them, a lot of them were pretty nascent and weren't much beyond sort of proof of concept. But when we sort of talked to them about, well, what would it take to get these solutions more widely adopted? What would make them more commercial? Some of the barriers that were identified with the business structure, the business models making adoption solutions to address trust issues really difficult, the lack of a clear value proposition regarding the economic benefit of adoption, big issues with digital readiness and digital compliance. And I'll cover off on this point more in some of the end slides, the issues around implementing solutions individually to address what were really sector systemic trust issues. So again, just to revisit the objectives, the original objectives, the main output being develop a framework to quantify trust within value chains. So we went ahead and did that and basically determined that the cost of breakdown in transactional trust components is a pretty simple equation. It's the rate of occurrence of a breakdown in trust in the value chain by the expected monetary loss when that breakdown occurs, by the percentage preventable if a technology solution is applied. And so the overall value of trust, the systemic trust value in a value chain, is basically then the sum of all those transactional trust components. So an example where we applied that, one of the case studies we looked at was a feedlot in Queensland who had a, it was a reasonably large feedlot, and they'd had an issue with a transactional trust breakdown a few years ago, where a cow was mistakenly loaded onto a truck when it was still within the withholding period. And running through that through our equation, the probability of the breakdown occurrence, it had only happened once in 34 years of operation. So that's a 1 in 500 chance of it happening again. And when we sort of really pushed them on, yeah, but would you expect that to happen more? They were quite clear that the systems that they had in place, they felt were adequate to address that, and that it really was something, while it was significant, when you look then at what that actually cost them in terms of, it was, a $900,000 episode, essentially, in that breakdown of trust, they were still sort of adamant that the chance of it happening again was very, very low. Then the percentage of loss preventable from using a technology solution, it's never 100%. There is always a possibility of human error. So that's estimated about 90%. When you run that through the equation, you get the value proposition at sort of on a yearly basis in the chance that it's going to happen again at very low, the $1,620. Now you look at that, and then there's immediately some issues with the framework, obviously. It just doesn't provide answers that feel right or give much guidance other than an individual discovery process for each business. So, for example, another business may not have had the sorts of options in place that gave them confidence that this thing wouldn't happen again and happen again soon. So that then gets immediately to what is, for every business, a highly individualized risk appetite related to their balance sheet position or their ability to carry risk. This particular enterprise had a very strong balance sheet, even though it was a very significant loss. They looked at, they assessed the chances of it happening again, their ability essentially to self-insure against that sort of loss. And they just, were basically making the decision that they could carry that risk. So while the size of the loss might be large, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a value proposition for solving it, or the value proposition for solving it is equally large, depending on the business. Now, scaling to whole industry obviously changes the size of the prize, but not necessarily the individual business appetite for adoption. Individual business adoption fixes a problem. Industry adoption potentially adds value. And I'll get to that again at the end. So at that point, we sort of looked at it and looked at the original outputs from the project and understanding what we were trying to do. And we realized it was time to take a different approach. So the initial scope was develop a framework to quantify trust within AVCs. We changed that to developing a process to evaluate the impact of a trust breakdown. So it's more of a self-evaluation and ability to incorporate risk attitudes that could be more appropriate for a diverse range of organisations and commodities, and also provided more of an ability to analyze the systemic versus transactional trust elements. So you get to things like this, which is really sort of understanding more the imperative for action in relation to the likelihood of occurrence and the impact of occurrence, rather than just the expectation that there will be a number which tells you whether there is a value proposition in solving the problem or not. So on the left there is just that's essentially just a hypothetical number of different circumstances of trust breakdown that are then plotted out on the graph on the right to show that there is a whole range of, while the numbers, the value proposition numbers, the dollar numbers might be relatively similar, in terms of where they fall on a likelihood versus impact map can vary pretty significantly, which then informs or impacts on whether that value proposition is one that you're going to take up or not. The other way of looking at that's more directly related to risk appetite is understanding that so that formula that we put up there before is really all about the direct costs. By implementing a technology to solve this problem, what are the direct costs that you are avoiding when there is a breakdown in trust by implementing that technology? But there's also indirect costs, and very importantly, there's opportunity costs. So if we think in this example of, say, a transaction security trust breakdown, the direct costs, so if we're thinking of a grains enterprise, for instance, the direct costs could be medium, because most grains enterprises will distribute who they sell to, how much they sell in any one transaction, to mitigate some of that risk, some of that transactional security risk. So the direct cost risk there, the risk appetite might be medium. Indirect costs relatively low. The opportunity costs, though, are high, because there is that you are taking that more cautious approach. You are potentially missing out on more risky transactions that you might undertake for higher value contracts, because you are just a bit, you're mitigating some of that risk that's involved. So if you classify your the risk that you're taking in each of those, and then there's an equation there that comes up with an overall cost impact rating that you can then also multiply with whether you are a risk averse business, a risk neutral business, or a risk taking business, to come up with an overall trust component impact score, which will help inform you in relation to that the dollar figure on the value proposition for solving that particular, or implementing technology for solving that trust breakdown, whether in relation to your risk appetite that's something that you want to take up or not. So the takeaways from the project. That the risk attitude or business sensitivities are far more likely to have a far greater impact on the value proposition of implementing a technology to a trust breakdown than the directly calculable likelihood of loss due to that breakdown. It's particularly applicable to technology which addresses single transactional trust issues, and it's these trust issues which are the most likely to be immediately relevant to farm businesses. The value proposition for solving transactional trust issues is also diluted for individual value chain actors. So you get much better value when a technology that is applied to solving a trust issue is applied throughout the entire value chain. The public good nature of trust creates free riders, so that's sort of in relation to the last point, in both directions, either as non-paying beneficiaries or as innocent casualties, creating cultural barriers for adoption of technology solutions. So what all of that means is that solving systemic trust issues, which is the big picture sort of issue around trust, is highly unlikely to be achieved by one organisational value chain in isolation. The value proposition is just simply not there for individual value chains and companies to make large investments and have competitors free ride the benefits. But even while recognising that, the majority of the interviews undertaken for the project, the systemic trust issues were identified as having the most urgent need for solutions. The uptake of technology to address trust issues is constrained by a lack of clarity on the value proposition, which can be addressed by measuring the value of the trust, noting that it's inherently difficult to measure a context-dependent phenomenon. So knowing a dollar value for the implementation of a technology solution provides AVC actors with an approximate baseline for a cost-benefit analysis. However, these assessments are innately subjective and relative to the actor's business needs and risk appetite. So in summary, the 2 points, and I guess, I'm going to short circuit one of your questions I know you're going to ask me, Mick, the eureka moment sort of out of all of this. Resolving transactional trust issues avoids loss generally to a business. Solving systemic trust issues actually creates added value. So when you address and solve the systemic trust for entire value chain, you create new value, you create new products, potentially, you create new market opportunities. But the paradox to that is that systemic trust is built through fixing all the transactional trust issues, and there is a real problem with the business case for individual businesses adopting transactional trust solutions. And so the solution to that is industry. The solution is, or what will help address all of that is industry efforts, industry things like, and with Integrity Systems Company being the industry partner with this, NLIS is a classic case. Which was an industry-led effort around solving trust issues, which did create added value for and systemic trust. And I'll pull it up there. Sorry, Mick, I think I've gone a little bit over time.
That's okay, Richard. Thank you very much for that. It was a really great talk. So thank you for sharing basically the outcomes of that whole project with us. We did have a question that I want to ask. You made the example of the red meat abattoir that shut down, and it was a 1 in 34 year occurrence of that particular case happening. So obviously that sort of 1 in 34 year occurrence makes it a cheap proposition for adopting mitigating technologies. But how do you factor in the likes of maturity of the adopter? So, a company that's 34 years old, how do you factor in the maturity of the company when they're looking at sort of potentially utilizing a solution like this?
So that's sort of where we then went to that risk appetite approach. So, that particular business can carry a large amount of risk just because of the maturity of their business, their balance sheet position, their ability to do that. A new entrant obviously would have nowhere near that ability. Their risk appetite would be much, much lower, and they'd be much more likely to adopt a technology solution to completely remove the risk of being in that position.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. And question here from Dave Lamb. Is it the case that the industry as a whole works to build systemic trust, but single actors in industry can destroy it? And if so, how do you weaken that unfortunate interconnection?
Yeah, Dave, look, 100%. And we make that comment in the report, that free rider approach is a real issue and works both ways, because you can have a single, I hesitate to call them bad actors, but, an actor in a value chain that through poor practice can destroy the reputation, the systemic trust, essentially, of the entire value chain. Look at, say, some of the food safety issues we've had recently in horticulture, the rock melons, for instance. The one farm completely randomly, and not bad practice, just, dust storms coming in and bringing bacteria onto rock melons. I don't know how you would have, it would have been difficult to sort of anticipate and prevent that. And that really destroyed, the entire rock melon industry for a short time. So yeah, that's a definite, it's a definite issue.
Thank you. All right, Richard, we might pull it up there, but thank you very much for your talk and being part of our symposium today. It's been great to have you here. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Mick. Thanks for the opportunity.